In the scorching heat of June 1098, a starving army of Christian knights, reduced to eating boiled leather and their own war horses, marched out of the gates of Antioch to face an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 2-1, and our silver-armored good knight walked among them, hollow-eyed and gaunt, clutching a spear in hands that trembled not from fear, but from months of famine. This wasn't a battle born of strategy or ambition. It was a death march, a final act of desperation by men who had survived 8 months of siege warfare, only to find themselves trapped inside the very city they had conquered, besieged by a massive Seljuk coalition army led by Kerbogha of Mosul. But in the days before the battle, a peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have visions of St. Andrew, leading to the discovery of a rusted iron spearhead buried beneath the Cathedral of St. Peter, the Holy Lance, the very weapon said to have pierced the side of Christ on the cross. Watch as this relic transforms a broken, starving mob into a fanatical war machine, as the good knight charges through walls of smoke and fire into the heart of a Turkish army, and as one of the most improbable victories in medieval history unfolds on the dusty plains outside Antioch's walls. From the political fractures that doomed Kerbogha's coalition to the white knights that appeared in the smoke, saints or hallucinations born of starvation, every moment of this battle defied the logic of war and rewrote the fate of the First Crusade. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive journeys through history's most pivotal battles, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks beside you through the blood, the dust, and the miracles that shaped our world. Comment below which battle you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and step back into the summer of 1098, when God, or desperation, decided the fate of the Holy Land. Chapter 1. The City of Ghosts. The good knight stood on the walls of Antioch in the pre-dawn darkness of June 28, 1098, and looked out over the plain where he would likely die. His silver armor, once polished to a mirror sheen, was dull now, streaked with rust and grime. It hung loose on his frame. He had lost weight. They all had. Beneath the mail hauberk, his ribs pressed against his skin like the bars of a cage. His hands, resting on the cold stone of the battlement, were skeletal. The knuckles stood out sharp and white. He had not eaten a full meal in 2 months. Behind him, the city of Antioch sprawled in the half-light, a labyrinth of narrow streets and crumbling Roman walls. It was a city of ghosts now. The living moved through it like shadows, their faces hollow, their eyes too large in their skulls. The smell was everywhere, rot and smoke and human waste. The dead had been piled in the streets during the worst days of the famine. Some had been buried. Others had simply been left. The good knight had seen men boil their own shoes. He had seen them scrape the hides off dead horses and simmer them for hours, trying to extract some trace of nourishment from the leather. He had seen them dig in the dirt for roots, for insects, for anything that could be chewed and swallowed. He had seen a knight, a man of noble birth, a man who had once owned lands and vassals, on his hands and knees in an alley, weeping as he tried to eat a fistful of stinging nettles. The good knight had done the same. There was no shame left. Shame required the luxury of choice, and there were no choices here. There was only survival, and even that was a thin, fragile thing, slipping away day by day. He turned his gaze back to the plain. Out there, in the darkness, Kerbogha's army waited. The good knight had seen it from the walls, an ocean of tents and banners stretching to the horizon. Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Persians, horsemen from the steppes, archers from the deserts, warriors from a dozen cities and emirates. Kerbogha, the Atabeg of Mosul, had gathered them all, a coalition army that dwarfed the Crusader force in every measure. Numbers, supplies, horses. especially horses. The good knight's destrier was dead. He had killed it himself 3 weeks ago, driving a knife into its throat while it stood trembling in the stable, too weak to resist. He had wept as he did it. The horse had carried him across half the world, from the green hills of his homeland, across the mountains and rivers of Europe, through the deserts of Anatolia. It had been his companion, his partner in war, and he had eaten it. They all had. By the time the siege tightened, there were fewer than 200 horses left in the entire Crusader army. An army that had once been built on the shock and power of heavy cavalry was now, by necessity, an infantry force. The knights would fight on foot. The princes would walk into battle beside their men. It was an absurdity, a tragedy. And yet, the good knight thought, perhaps it was also a kind of justice. They had come to this land as conquerors, armored and mounted, certain of their superiority. Now they would face their enemy as beggars, starving and desperate, with nothing left but their faith and their swords. If they had even that. The good knight's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword. The blade was still sharp. He had kept it that way, even when there was no food, even when his hands shook too much to hold a whetstone steady. A knight could lose everything, but he could not lose his edge. He heard footsteps behind him, slow, uneven, the sound of a man who was too tired to lift his feet properly. "You're up early." The good knight turned. It was Arnulf, a Flemish man-at-arms who had fought beside him since the siege began. Arnulf's face was gaunt, his cheeks sunken, his beard matted and filthy. He looked 60 years old. He was 25. "I couldn't sleep," the good knight said. Arnulf nodded. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard from the effort of climbing the stairs. "No one can. They're all awake down there, praying, confessing. Some of them are writing letters they'll never send." The good knight said nothing. Arnulf looked out at the plain. "Do you think we'll win?" The good knight considered the question. It was a reasonable thing to ask. A man facing death had a right to know the odds. "No," he said. Arnulf laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "At least you're honest. We're outnumbered. We're starving. We have no cavalry. Kerbogha's army is fresh, well-fed, and mounted. By every measure, we should lose. And yet we're going out there anyway." "Yes. Why?" The good knight turned to look at him. "Because there's nowhere else to go." Arnulf was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "Death ground. Death ground." The good knight agreed. It was an old concept, older than Christianity, older than Rome. When an army had no line of retreat, when surrender meant death and flight meant death, and staying meant death, then the only option left was to fight with the fury of the damned. Men on death ground did not calculate odds. They did not weigh risks. They simply fought, because fighting was the only thing left. The good knight had read about it once, in a manuscript copied from some ancient Eastern text. He could not remember the author's name, but he remembered the principle. Place your army on death ground, and it will fight as if already dead. "Do you believe in the lance?" Arnulf asked suddenly. The good knight hesitated. The lance. The holy lance. It had been 10 days since Peter Bartholomew, a ragged Provençal peasant, had stood before the assembled princes and clergy and declared that Saint Andrew had appeared to him in a vision. The saint had told him that the lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ as he hung on the cross, was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter, here in Antioch. At first, no one had believed him. Peter was a nobody, a man of no rank or education. known more for his wild stories than his piety. Even Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate and the spiritual leader of the crusade, had been skeptical. He had seen too many false relics, too many charlatans peddling splinters of the true cross or vials of the Virgin's tears. But Raymond of Toulouse, the Count of Provence, had believed. Or perhaps he had simply been desperate enough to gamble on hope. On June 15th, they had dug. The good knight had not been there. He had been on the walls, watching for a Turkish assault, but he had heard the story from a dozen men who were. They had torn up the floor of the cathedral, digging through stone and packed earth, while Peter Bartholomew stood over them, shouting directions. Hours passed. The sun climbed and fell. The diggers grew exhausted, their hands bleeding, their backs bent. And then, as the light began to fail, Peter himself had leapt into the pit. Moments later, he had emerged, holding aloft a rusted iron spearhead. The crowd had erupted. Men wept. They fell to their knees. They kissed the ground. The holy lance had been found. Adhemar had remained silent. His face, the good knight had been told, was unreadable. He did not denounce the relic, but he did not embrace it either. He was a careful man, a scholar, and he knew that faith and fraud often wore the same face. But the army did not care about Adhemar's doubts. They had the lance. God had not abandoned them. "Do you believe in it?" Arnulf asked again. The good knight looked out at the plain, at the darkness where Kerbogha's army waited. "I believe," he said slowly, "that men who believe they are carrying the weapon of Christ will fight harder than men who do not." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." Arnulf grunted. "Fair enough." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sky lighten in the east. The stars were fading. The plain was beginning to take shape, a flat expanse of dry grass and dust, bounded on one side by the Orontes River and on the other by the low hills that rose toward the mountains. It was good ground for cavalry, bad ground for infantry. The good knight's thoughts drifted to the plan, such as it was. Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince who had taken command of the field operations, had divided the army into 6 main divisions, with a 7th held in reserve to guard the flanks. It was a sound plan, as far as it went, but it relied on discipline, on the ability of starving, exhausted men to hold formation under a hail of arrows and the thunder of hooves. The good knight would be in the 4th division, under Adhemar of Le Puy, the spiritual heart of the army, the division that would carry the Holy Lance into battle. Raymond of Aguilera, the priest who had overseen the excavation, would bear the relic. He would walk at the front of the formation, holding the lance aloft so that every man could see it. The good knight wondered if Raymond's hands would shake. He wondered if his own would. "They're opening the gates," Arnulf said. The good knight looked down. Far below, at the base of the wall, the bridge gate was swinging open. The 1st Division, Hugh of Vermandois and Robert of Flanders, was beginning to move out. The sound of armor and footsteps echoed up the stone. "God help us," Arnulf muttered. The good knight said nothing. He turned and began to descend the stairs. Chapter 2. The Crossing. The bridge gate was chaos. Men pressed together in the narrow passage, shoulder to shoulder, their breath hot and sour in the confined space. The good knight could smell them, sweat and rust and the faint, sickly sweet odor of infection. Many of the men were wounded, their injuries poorly healed or still festering. Dysentery was rampant. Some men had soiled themselves and no longer cared. The good knight kept his eyes forward and moved with the crowd. Outside the gate, the world opened up. The plain stretched before them, vast and empty in the early morning light. The Orontes River glittered to the left, a ribbon of silver cutting through the brown landscape. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for 3 men abreast, and the crossing was slow. The good knight stepped onto the wooden planks. They creaked under his weight. Below, the water moved sluggishly, thick with silt. He could see fish, small, dark shapes darting in the shallows. His stomach clenched. He had not eaten fish in months. He had not eaten anything of substance in weeks. He forced the thought away and kept walking. On the far side of the bridge, the First Division was already forming up. Hugh of Vermandois, the younger brother of the King of France, sat on one of the few remaining horses, his banner snapping in the breeze. He looked pale, his face drawn, but his voice was steady as he shouted orders. "Form ranks! Shields up! Keep the line tight!" The men obeyed. They moved slowly, their bodies stiff and clumsy, but they moved. The good knight watched them and felt a flicker of something that might have been pride. These men were dying. They knew it, and yet they were still soldiers. The Second Division began to cross. Then the Third. The good knight's division, the Fourth, waited on the Antioch side of the bridge. He stood in the press of bodies, his shield on his arm, his spear in his hand. The wood of the spear shaft was smooth and worn. He had carried it since the siege began. It was a simple weapon, nothing ornate, but it was well balanced and strong. He would need it to be strong. Beside him, a young knight was praying. His lips moved silently, his eyes closed. The good knight did not know his name. He had seen him before, on the walls, but they had never spoken. The young knight's hands were clasped around a wooden cross that hung from his neck. The good knight wondered if the cross would stop an arrow. He doubted it. "Fourth Division, forward!" The call came from the front. Adhemar of Le Puy, the Bishop of Le Puy, the papal legate, the man who had led them in prayer and penance for nearly a year, was mounted on a thin, sway-backed horse. He wore his mitre and his vestments over his mail. In his hand he held a staff topped with a cross, and behind him, walking on foot, was Raymond of Aguilers. He carried the lance. The good knight saw it as the crowd shifted. A dull iron spearhead mounted on a wooden shaft, wrapped in cloth at the base. It looked old. It looked ordinary. It looked like hope. The men around him began to murmur. Some reached out, as if to touch it, though they were too far away. Others fell to their knees even as the line moved forward, and had to be pulled back to their feet by their comrades. The good knight did not kneel. He walked. The bridge was even more crowded now. The good knight's shoulder pressed against the man in front of him. He could feel the heat of the bodies around him, the weight of the armor, the pressure of the crowd. For a moment he felt a spike of panic. If the bridge collapsed, if the wood gave way, they would all go into the water, dragged down by the weight of their mail. But the bridge held. He stepped off onto the far side and felt the solid earth beneath his feet. The plain stretched before him, and in the distance he saw them. Kerbogha's army. Chapter 3. The Horde. They covered the horizon. The good knight had seen large armies before. He had fought in the great battles of Europe, where kings and dukes gathered their levies and marched to war. He had seen fields filled with banners and the glint of steel. But this was different. This was not an army. This was a migration, a nation on the move. The Turkish camp sprawled across the plain like a city of canvas. Thousands of tents arranged in neat rows, their peaks fluttering with pennants and flags. The banners were a riot of color, red and green and gold, embroidered with crescents and stars and script in a language the good knight could not read. And between the tents, the men, horsemen mostly, light cavalry, mounted on small, fast horses bred for the steppes. They wore lamella armor, small plates of iron or leather laced together, and conical helmets. Their bows were short and recurved, designed to be fired from the saddle. The good knight had faced these men before, during the long march through Anatolia. He knew their tactics. They would swarm and harass, loosing arrows from a distance, retreating before the Crusaders could close. They would not stand and fight. They would bleed the enemy slowly, patiently, until there was nothing left. But there were others too. Heavier cavalry, armored in mail, carrying lances and swords. Ghulams, slave soldiers trained from childhood in the art of war. These men would charge. These men would fight. And there were thousands of them. The good knight's division finished crossing the bridge and began to form up on the plain. The other divisions were already in position, 6 blocks of infantry, arranged in a rough line, stretching from the river to the hills. The 7th Division, under Reynard of Bartia, Toll, was held back near the bridge, ready to respond to threats on the flanks. It was a good formation. Solid, defensive. It was also pitifully small. The good knight looked at the men around him. He counted perhaps 3,000 in his division, maybe 4. The entire Crusader army, all 6 divisions combined, numbered no more than 20,000. Kerbogha's army was at least twice that size, perhaps more. The good knight tightened his grip on his spear. From the walls of Antioch, behind them, the sound of singing drifted across the plain. The clergy had lined the battlements, and they were chanting. Psalms and hymns, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that was both mournful and defiant. Deus vult, Deus vult, Deus vult. God wills it. The good knight did not know if God willed it or not, but he knew that he was here, standing on this plain, with a spear in his hand and an enemy before him. That would have to be enough. A horn sounded from the Turkish lines, so the good knight's heart began to pound. The enemy was moving. They came like a wave. Not a charge, not yet, but a slow, rolling advance. The Turkish horsemen moved forward in loose formation, their horses trotting, their bows in their hands. They did not shout. They did not roar. They simply came, a tide of men and steel, spreading across the plain. "Shields!" Adamar's voice rang out. "Shields up! Hold the line!" The good knight raised his shield, a tall kite shield, painted with a faded red cross. It was heavy. His arm ached from holding it, but he held it. The man beside him did the same, and the man beside him. All down the line the shields came up, overlapping, forming a wall of wood and iron. The good knight crouched slightly, his knees bent, his weight balanced. He had done this 100 times, 1,000. It was the fundamental posture of infantry combat, low, stable, ready to absorb impact. The Turkish horsemen were 200 yards away now. 150, 100. The first arrows came. They rose from the Turkish, lines in a dark cloud, arcing high into the sky, blotting out the sun for a moment before they fell. The good knight heard them before he saw them, a hissing, rustling sound, like wind through dry grass. Then they struck. The impact was like hail. Arrows slammed into shields, into the ground, into flesh. The good knight felt his shield shudder as an arrow punched into the wood, the iron head stopping just short of his arm. Another arrow skittered off his helmet with a metallic clang that left his ears ringing. Around him, men screamed. A knight to his right went down, an arrow through his throat. Blood sprayed across the good knight's armor. The man clawed at the shaft, his eyes wide, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then he collapsed. The good knight stepped into the gap. Another volley. Another. The arrows fell like rain. The good knight kept his shield up. His arm was shaking now, the muscles burning. He could feel the weight of the shield dragging him down. But he held it. Hold the line. Hold the line. Hold the line. The Turkish horsemen wheeled and retreated, loosing arrows as they went. Then they turned and came again. This was their way of war. Harassment. Attrition. They would not close with the Crusader infantry. Not yet. They would simply stand off and shoot over and over until the line broke or the men were too exhausted to fight. But the line did not break. The good knight looked down the formation. Men were falling. He could see the gaps opening, the bodies on the sand and ground. But the line held. The shields stayed up. The men stayed in place. And then, slowly, the Crusaders began to advance. It was not a charge. It was a walk. A slow, grinding, inexorable walk. The good knight put one foot in front of the other, his shield raised, his spear ready. The man beside him did the same. And the man beside him. The entire line moved forward. The Turkish horsemen loosed another volley. The arrows struck. Men fell. The line kept moving. The good knight's mind was empty now. There was no room for thought, no room for fear. There was only the rhythm of his feet, the weight of his shield, the pressure of the men around him. One step, another, another. The Turkish horsemen retreated again, their horses wheeling, their bows singing. The Crusaders kept walking. The good knight did not see the order given. He did not hear the command. But suddenly, the plain ahead of him was burning. The Turks had set fire to the dry grass. Flames leapt up, orange and yellow, spreading fast in the wind. Smoke billowed across the field, thick and black, choking the air. The good knight's eyes began to water. He coughed, his lungs burning, and pulled the edge of his cloak over his mouth. Around him, men were shouting. Some were panicking, breaking formation, stumbling backward. The fire was spreading toward them, a wall of heat and smoke. "Hold!" Adamar's voice, hoarse but steady. "Hold the line! God is with us!" The good knight held. The smoke was so thick now that he could barely see. The man in front of him was a shadow, a vague shape in the haze. The heat was intense. The good knight could feel it through his armor, baking his skin. And then, impossibly, the wind shifted. The smoke began to blow back toward the Turkish lines. The good knight blinked, his eyes streaming. Through the haze, he saw the flames retreating, the smoke rolling away. And he saw something else. Riders. 3 of them, mounted on white horses, their armor gleaming even through the smoke. They rode at the front of the Crusader line, their swords raised, their banners streaming. The good knight stared. He knew those riders were not real. He knew it. There were no white horses left in the army. There were barely any horses at all. But he saw them, and so did every other man on the field. "St. George!" someone screamed. "St. George and St. Demetrius!" The cry was taken up, spreading down the line like wildfire. "St. George! St. Mercurius! The saints are with us!" The good knight did not know if he believed it. He did not know if it mattered. What mattered was that the men around him believed it, and they charged. The good knight ran. His legs were weak, his body starved, but he ran. The men around him ran. The entire line surged forward, screaming, their voices raw and wild. "Deus vult! Deus vult! Deus vult!" The Turkish horsemen, caught off guard by the sudden ferocity of the charge, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. The Crusaders crashed into them. The good knight drove his spear into the chest of a mounted archer. The man screamed and fell, dragging the spear with him. The good knight let it go and drew his sword. The world became a blur of motion and violence. A Turkish ghulam swung a curved sword at his head. The good knight ducked, felt the blade whistle past, and drove his own sword up into the man's armpit, where the armor did not cover. Blood sprayed. The ghulam toppled from his horse. The good knight stepped over him and kept moving. A horse reared in front of him, its hooves flashing. He threw himself to the side, rolled, came up swinging. His sword caught the rider across the thigh. The man screamed and fell. The good knight's vision was narrowing. He could see only what was directly in front of him, a tunnel of blood and steel. His breath came in ragged gasps. His heart hammered in his chest. He was going to die here. He knew it. And yet he kept fighting. A spear thrust at him from the left. He blocked it with his shield, felt the impact jar his arm, and slashed at the spearman's face. The blade connected. The man fell. The good knight stumbled. His legs were giving out. He could feel the strength draining from his body, the adrenaline fading. And then, suddenly, the pressure eased. The Turkish line was breaking. The good knight looked up, his vision swimming. Through the haze of exhaustion and smoke, he saw the enemy retreating. Not in order, not in formation. They were fleeing. The Crusaders pursued, screaming, their swords red. The good knight did not pursue. He stood in place, his sword hanging loose in his hand. He was alive. He did not know how. But he was alive. The collapse of Kerbogha's army was not a single moment. It was a cascade, a chain reaction of fear and betrayal that spread through the coalition like plague. The good knight, standing in the blood-soaked grass, watched it happen. First, the Damascene contingent broke. Duke of Damascus, watching the ferocity of the Crusader charge and the strange resilience of their infantry, made a calculation. His men were not dying for Kerbogha's ambitions. He ordered the withdrawal. His banners turned, his horsemen wheeled and rode east. The sight of the Damascenes leaving the field sent a shockwave through the rest of the coalition. If Damascus was abandoning the fight, what did that mean for the others? Were they being left to die? Was this a trap? Panic spread. Sökmen ibn Artuk, the commander of the Artukid forces, saw the Damascenes go and made the same choice. His men followed. Then the emirs of Homs, then the Kurds, then the Persians. Within minutes, the entire Turkish army was in full retreat. Kerbogha, the Atabeg of Mosul, the man who had gathered this great coalition, found himself abandoned. His own men were fleeing. He had no choice but to follow. The Crusaders pursued. The good knight did not join the pursuit. He could not. His legs would not carry him. He sank to his knees in the grass, his sword still in his hand, and watched as the army he had thought would kill him dissolved into a stampede of terrified men and horses. Around him, other men were collapsing. Some were weeping. Some were laughing. Some were praying. The good knight simply breathed. In, out, he was alive. The pursuit lasted for hours. The Crusaders chased the fleeing Turks all the way to the Iron Bridge, 12 miles from Antioch, cutting down stragglers and capturing those too slow to escape. By the time the good knight reached Kerbogha's camp, the sun was high and the killing was mostly done. The camp was vast, a city of tents stretching across the plain, and it was full of treasure. The good knight walked through it in a daze. His body moved on instinct, his mind numb. Around him, men were looting, tearing open chests, pulling down banners, dragging sacks of grain and barrels of wine from the supply tents. The contrast was obscene. Hours ago they had been starving. Now they stood in the midst of unimaginable wealth. The good knight found a tent near the center of the camp. It was large, richly decorated, the walls hung with silk. Inside, there was a low table, cushions, a brazier, and food, bread, dried fruit, Cheese? Meat. The good knight stared at it. His hands were shaking. He picked up a piece of bread. It was soft, still fresh. He brought it to his mouth and bit down. The taste exploded on his tongue. It was the most delicious thing he had ever eaten. He ate another piece, and another. He could not stop. His stomach, shrunken and weak, protested, but he ignored it. He ate until he could not eat any more, and then he collapsed onto the cushions and closed his eyes. Outside, the sounds of looting and celebration continued. Men were singing, shouting, laughing. The good knight did not join them. He lay in the tent, his armor still on, his sword still at his side, and stared at the silk ceiling. He had survived. Against all odds, against all reason, he had survived. But the cost of that survival, the things he had seen, the things he had done, the taste of leather soup and the sight of the white knights in the smoke, would stay with him forever. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, he slept. The good knight woke to the sound of bells. For a moment, he did not know where he was. The silk walls of the tent, the cushions beneath him, the smell of incense and spices. It was all wrong, all foreign. Then memory returned. The battle, the rout, the camp. He sat up slowly, his body aching. His stomach was cramping. He had eaten too much, too fast, but the pain was almost welcome. It was the pain of fullness, not hunger. He stood and walked to the entrance of the tent. Outside, the plain was a chaos of activity. Crusaders were everywhere, hauling loot, leading captured horses, dragging prisoners. The Turkish camp was being systematically stripped, but the bells were coming from Antioch. The good knight looked toward the city. The walls were lined with men, and above them the banners of the Crusade flew from the towers. The citadel had surrendered. Ahmed ibn Marwan, the commander of the garrison that had held the high fortress throughout the siege, had watched the battle from the heights of Mount Silpius. He had seen Kerbogha's army shatter. He had seen the Crusaders pursue them to the horizon. And he had made the only rational choice. He had surrendered. The good knight felt a strange emptiness at the news. It should have been a moment of triumph. The city was theirs. The siege was over. The First Crusade could continue. But all he felt was exhaustion. He turned and walked back into the tent. His armor was still on, the mail heavy on his shoulders. He began to remove it, piece by piece, his hands moving slowly, methodically. The hauberk, the coif, the gauntlets. Beneath the armor, his body was a map of scars and bruises. His ribs stood out sharply. His skin was pale, almost translucent. He looked like a corpse, but he was alive. He sat down on the cushions and stared at his hands. They were shaking again. Not from hunger this time, from something else. He had killed men today. He did not know how many. 5? 10? More? He had driven his sword into their sahar. Bodies felt the resistance of flesh and bone, seen the light go out of their eyes. And he had felt nothing. No rage, no sorrow, just a cold, mechanical efficiency. That frightened him more than the battle itself. He closed his eyes and tried to pray. The words came haltingly, half-remembered fragments of Latin. Pater noster, qui es in caelis, our Father, who art in heaven. But the prayer felt hollow, empty. He did not know if God was listening. He did not know if God had ever been listening. All he knew was that he had survived, and that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, he would have to do it all again, because the road to Jerusalem was still long, and the good knight would walk it, whether God willed it or not. 3 days after the battle, the good knight stood in the Cathedral of St. Peter and looked at the place where the Holy Lance had been found. The floor had been repaired, the stones had been set back in place. But the memory of that day, the digging, the desperation, the moment when Peter Bartholomew had emerged from the pit with the rusted spearhead held high, lingered in the air like incense. The lance itself was gone. It had been taken by Raymond of Aguilé, who guarded it jealously, carrying it in processions, displaying it to the faithful. Men kissed it. They wept before it. They swore oaths upon it. The good knight did not know if it was real. He did not know if it mattered. What mattered was that it had given the army something to believe in, and that belief had carried them through the fire and the arrows and the desperate, bloody clash on the plain. Belief was a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon of all. The good knight turned and walked out of the cathedral. The streets of Antioch were still crowded, still filthy, but the mood had changed. Men were no longer hollow-eyed and starving. They were loud, boisterous, drunk on victory and looted wine. The good knight did not join them. He walked to the walls and climbed the stairs to the battlements. From there, he could see the plain where the battle had been fought. The grass was trampled, the earth churned to mud. Carrion birds circled overhead, feasting on the dead. The good knight stood and watched them. He thought about the white knights he had seen in the smoke. St. George, St. Demetrius, St. Mercurius. Had they been real? Had God truly sent his saints to fight beside them? Or had it been a trick of the light, a hallucination born of starvation and desperation? The good knight did not know, but he knew that he had seen them, and he knew that every other man on that field had seen them too. And in the end, perhaps that was the same thing. He turned and looked south, toward the distant mountains, toward the road that led to Jerusalem. The First Crusade was not over. It had barely begun. There would be more battles, more sieges, more suffering, and the good knight would be there for all of it, because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. He survived. He walked through history, a witness to its greatest and most terrible moments, and he endured. The silver armor would be polished again. The sword would be sharpened. The body would heal. And when the army marched south, the good knight would march with them, because the road to Jerusalem was long, and the good knight had miles to go before he rested. Epilogue. The cost of miracles. In the weeks that followed the Battle of Antioch, the Crusader army remained in the city, recovering from the ordeal of the siege and the battle. The dead were buried. The wounded were tended. The supplies from Kerbogha's camp were distributed. But the victory had come at a cost. Adhemar of Lipui, the papal legate, the spiritual leader of the crusade, fell ill. On August 1st, 1098, he died. Some said it was plague, others said it was exhaustion. The good knight thought it was simply the weight of what they had done, the burden of leading men through hell and calling it the will of God. Without Adhemar, the unity of the crusade began to fracture. The princes quarreled over the spoils of Antioch. Bohemond claimed the city as his own, defying the oaths he had sworn to the Byzantine emperor. Raymond of Toulouse disputed the claim. The army, which had been united by desperation, began to splinter. But the lance remained. Peter Bartholomew continued to have visions. He claimed that St. Andrew spoke to him, giving him instructions, warnings, prophecies. Some believed him. Others did not. In April of 1099, Peter would undergo an ordeal by fire to prove the authenticity of the lance. He would walk through a corridor of flames, carrying the relic. He would emerge burned and broken, and he would die of his wounds 12 days later. But that was still months away, for now the lance was still a symbol of hope, a reminder that God had not abandoned them. The good knight did not know if that was true, but he knew that the men needed to believe it, and so he said nothing. He simply prepared for the next march, the next battle, the next trial, because the road to Jerusalem was still long, and the good knight would walk it to the end. Chapter 11. The Silver Knight's Reflection. On the night before the army was to march south, the good knight sat alone on the walls of Antioch and looked up at the stars. They were the same stars he had seen from his homeland years ago, before the Crusade began. The same stars that had watched over him as he crossed mountains and deserts, as he fought and bled and starved. The stars did not care about the battles of men. They did not care about the lance or the visions or the miracles. They simply shone, cold and distant and eternal. The good knight found that comforting. He thought about the battle, about the moment when he had charged through the smoke, when he had seen the white knights, when he had felt the certainty that he was going to die. He had not died, he had survived. And now he would march to Jerusalem, and he would fight again, and perhaps this time he would not be so lucky. But that was the nature of war. That was the nature of the path he had chosen. He stood and looked down at the city below. Antioch, the city that had nearly killed them all, was now theirs. The banners of the crusade flew from its towers. The bells rang in its churches. It was a victory. But the good knight knew that victories were temporary. Cities could be lost as easily as they were won. Armies could be shattered. Kingdoms could fall. The only constant was the road. And the good knight would walk it, as he had always walked it, one step at a time, until the road ended or he did. He turned and descended the stairs, his silver armor gleaming in the moonlight. Tomorrow the march would begin, and the good knight would be ready. Chapter 12. The March to Destiny. The army left Antioch in November of 1098, 5 months after the battle. They marched south along the coast, through the cities of Syria, toward the ultimate goal of the crusade, Jerusalem. The good knight marched with them. His body had recovered. The weight had returned to his frame. His strength had returned to his limbs. But something had changed inside him. He no longer believed in the certainty of victory. He no longer believed in the righteousness of the cause. He believed only in the road. And the road led south, through the ruins of ancient cities, through the deserts and the mountains, through the lands where empires had risen and fallen, where prophets had walked and kings had ruled. The good knight walked through it all, a silent witness, a man in silver armor who had seen too much and said too little. And when the army finally reached Jerusalem, when they stormed the walls and took the city in a frenzy of blood and fire, the good knight was there. He fought, he killed, he survived, because that was what he did. But the memory of Antioch stayed with him, the taste of leather soup, the sight of the white knights in the smoke, the sound of the bells ringing over the plain. Those memories would never leave him. They were the price of survival, the cost of miracles, and the good knight would carry them with him through all the battles to come, through all the years and all the wars, until the end of his long, strange journey through history.